Put the cuffs on her before she runs." The words cracked through the little white church just as the organ began playing the wedding march, and in a single breath, every head in the room turned toward the open doors. Two police officers stood beneath the stained glass archway, rainwater still dripping from their dark uniforms onto the polished wooden floor. The flashing red and blue lights outside painted the church windows in restless colors, turning the soft Sunday morning into something cold and unreal. Naomi Carter froze halfway down the aisle, one trembling hand still wrapped around the bouquet of white roses her grandmother had grown behind their small brick house on Madison Street. Her satin dress brushed softly against the floor as silence spread through the room like smoke. Guests exchanged uneasy glances. Someone near the back whispered her name. Another person quietly lowered their phone. Officer Ryan Keller stepped forward first, broad shoulders stiff beneath the weight of authority, one hand resting near the radio clipped to his chest. His eyes locked onto Naomi with the kind of certainty that left no room for kindness. "Miss Carter," he said sharply, pulling a folded photograph from his jacket pocket, "you need to come with us immediately." Naomi blinked slowly, confused at first, as if her mind refused to understand what was happening. Just seconds earlier, she had been listening to the soft hum of the organ and the nervous breathing of flower girls beside the pews. Now the entire church stared at her like she had become someone else. "There must be a mistake," she said quietly, her voice barely rising above the sound of rain tapping the stained glass windows. Ryan ignored the trembling in her tone. He lifted the photograph higher for the people closest to him to see. Grainy security footage showed a black woman in white clothing outside a downtown bank, less than an hour earlier. "A witness identified you leaving the scene of a financial theft investigation," Ryan announced. Gasps rippled through the church. Naomi's grandmother, Evelyn Carter, slowly rose from the front pew, one fragile hand clutching her pearl necklace. "Officer," the elderly woman whispered, "my granddaughter has been here all morning." But Ryan barely looked at her. "We've heard that before." The sentence landed harder than anyone expected. Naomi felt it immediately, not just the accusation, but the assumption underneath it. Around her, guests shifted uncomfortably. A bridesmaid lowered her eyes. One of the caterers stopped moving entirely, frozen beside a silver tray of untouched champagne glasses. Naomi's throat tightened. She could suddenly hear every tiny sound inside the church. The soft crackle of candles burning near the altar, the distant hiss of police radios, the nervous squeak of shoes against old wooden floors. She swallowed hard and straightened her posture anyway. "Officer Keller," she said carefully, "I've never stolen anything in my life." Ryan stepped closer. "Then you won't mind answering questions downtown." His tone remained calm, but the humiliation in it spread through the room like ice water. Naomi could feel dozens of eyes moving over her dress, her skin, her face, measuring her against the accusation before she had even been allowed to defend herself. Outside, thunder rolled low across the city skyline. The heavy church doors remained wide open behind the officers, exposing gray skies and flashing patrol lights parked along the curb. A little boy near the aisle holding the wedding rings looked up at Naomi with frightened eyes. She forced herself to smile gently at him even while her own hands shook. That small act of composure somehow made the moment even more painful. Ryan noticed the movement and frowned slightly, almost irritated by her calmness. "Ma'am," he said again, firmer this time. "Step away from the altar." Naomi inhaled slowly. The scent of roses and candle wax filled her lungs. Somewhere high above them, sunlight tried breaking through the storm clouds, sending fractured beams of gold through the stained glass and across her veil. She stood there alone in the center of the aisle, while whispers crawled through the church like restless ghosts. And then, from somewhere behind the closed doors near the altar chambers, a man's voice suddenly echoed through the silence. "Why are my officers interrupting my wedding?" The entire church seemed to stop breathing. Officer Ryan Keller turned sharply toward the altar hallway, just as the wooden doors swung open with a slow metallic creak. Mayor Daniel Brooks stepped into view wearing a tailored black tuxedo, one hand adjusting the cuff of his sleeve as though he had walked into a minor inconvenience instead of public chaos. The storm outside flashed pale light across the polished floor, catching the silver mayoral pin near his jacket collar. For one long second, nobody moved. Ryan's face lost color almost immediately. The authority in his posture cracked beneath visible confusion. Mayor Brooks, he stammered softly, lowering the photograph halfway. Daniel's eyes moved past him first, straight to Naomi. The tension in his face softened the moment he saw her standing alone in the aisle, clutching her bouquet with trembling fingers. Her mascara had not run. Her shoulders were still straight, but he could see the hurt sitting quietly behind her eyes. Daniel walked toward her slowly, his dress shoes echoing against the church floor. Every guest watched him cross the aisle in complete silence. Naomi tried to speak, but emotion tightened her throat before any words came out. Daniel reached her and gently placed one hand over hers. The bouquet shook once beneath his fingers before becoming still. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. Naomi nodded, even though her breathing remained uneven. Daniel looked back toward Ryan then, and whatever warmth had been in his expression disappeared. "Officer Keller," he said calmly, "why are there police cars outside my wedding?" Ryan cleared his throat quickly. "Sir, we received a report connected to a theft investigation downtown. A witness identified Miss Carter near the scene." Daniel glanced briefly at the blurry photograph still hanging loosely in Ryan's hand. Rain crackled softly against the stained glass windows behind them. Somewhere near the back pews, an elderly woman sniffled quietly into a tissue. "And that was enough for you to interrupt a private ceremony?" Daniel asked. Ryan shifted his weight. The description matched. Daniel stared at him for several seconds. Not angry, not loud. Somehow that made the silence far worse. "Match what exactly?" Ryan opened his mouth, but hesitated. The church waited with him. Naomi slowly lowered her eyes toward the floor as if she already knew the answer before he could say it. Ryan finally spoke carefully. "Black female. White dress. Approximately early 30s. The words landed heavily inside the church. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. One bridesmaid closed her eyes briefly. Daniel inhaled once through his nose, slow and controlled. "So every black woman in white became a suspect today?" Ryan's jaw tightened instantly. "That is not what I meant, sir." "Then explain what you meant." Outside, thunder rolled again across the city. The flashing patrol lights continued spilling color through the church windows like restless ghosts. Ryan suddenly seemed very aware of every eye fixed on him. Naomi could feel it too. The entire room balancing between humiliation and disbelief. Daniel turned gently back toward her. "Naomi," he said quietly, "look at me." She lifted her eyes slowly. "You did nothing wrong." The simple sentence broke something fragile inside her chest. Her grandmother, Evelyn, pressed trembling fingers against her lips from the front pew, tears gathering in her tired eyes. Daniel squeezed Naomi's hand once before facing the officers again. "The suspect connected to the bank investigation was arrested 23 minutes ago near Riverside Station," he said calmly. "My office received confirmation before I even arrived at the church." Ryan blinked hard. That cannot be right. Daniel reached into his inside pocket and removed his phone. The glowing screen reflected faintly across his face as he held it toward the officer. "You interrupted this ceremony without verifying your own update logs." Ryan stared at the screen silently. The color drained further from his face with every passing second. Around him, the atmosphere inside the church shifted. Not loud, not dramatic, just heavy, like truth settling into the room 1 inch at a time. Naomi looked down at the white roses in her hands. One petal had loosened during the confrontation and now rested quietly near the hem of her dress. She stared at it while the rain softened outside and the church bell somewhere far downtown began ringing noon. Officer Ryan Keller lowered the photograph slowly, but the damage had already settled into the church like smoke after a fire. Nobody spoke. The silence itself seemed embarrassed. Rain continued sliding down the stained glass windows in thin silver lines while the red and blue reflections from the patrol cars outside pulsed faintly across the white walls. Naomi stood perfectly still beside Daniel Brooks, her fingers still wrapped around the bouquet, even though several petals now rested near her shoes. She could feel every eye in the church shifting away from her and toward the officers instead. That change should have felt comforting. Somehow it only made her chest ache more. Daniel slipped his hand gently around hers. "The ceremony is over for now," he said quietly without looking away from Ryan. "All officers will leave the property." Ryan nodded immediately. "Yes, sir." But his voice no longer carried authority. It sounded smaller now, uneven. The second officer near the entrance glanced awkwardly toward the pews before stepping backward toward the doors. Nobody stopped them. Nobody said anything at all. Naomi watched Ryan carefully as he turned to leave. For the first time since entering the church, he finally looked directly at her instead of through her. There was no anger left in his face now, only realization settling in slowly and painfully. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, the apology never fully came. Naomi looked at him for one long moment before lowering her eyes. She suddenly felt exhausted in a way sleep could never fix. Daniel noticed immediately. "Everyone please give us a few minutes," he said gently to the guests. Chairs shifted softly across the floor as people slowly began stepping outside into the damp afternoon air. Low whispers filled the church again, quieter now, uncertain and ashamed. Naomi's grandmother Evelyn approached carefully, one hand resting against the cane she carried everywhere after her hip surgery 2 winters earlier. Her lavender church hat trembled slightly as she reached Naomi. "Baby," she whispered, touching her cheek softly. "You all right?" Naomi tried smiling for her. "I am okay, Grandma." But her voice cracked halfway through the sentence. Evelyn pulled her carefully into a hug, pressing her against the soft fabric of her coat, while candlelight flickered behind them near the altar. Daniel looked away politely, giving them space. Outside the church doors, reporters had already begun gathering beneath umbrellas near the sidewalk after hearing police scanners mention the mayor's wedding. Camera flashes sparked faintly through the rain. Ryan saw them too. His stomach tightened immediately. One mistake had now become public, permanent. He removed his cap slowly as he stood beneath the church awning, cold rain mist brushing against his face. The younger officer beside him shifted nervously. "You did not know, man," he muttered quietly. Ryan stared at the wet pavement. "That is not the problem." Across the street, the flashing patrol lights reflected in puddles along the curb. Ryan could still hear his own words echoing inside his head. Black female, white dress, early 30s. He replayed the moment again and again, hearing now what everyone else in that church had heard immediately. Not evidence. Assumption. Inside, Naomi slowly sat down in the front pew, smoothing trembling fingers across her wedding dress. The satin fabric felt colder now against her skin. Daniel knelt beside her quietly. "We can postpone everything," he said softly. "Nobody would blame you." Naomi shook her head almost immediately. "If we stop now," she whispered, staring ahead at the empty altar, "then he takes more from this day than he already did." Daniel studied her face carefully. The strength there humbled him every time. She was hurt, humiliated, exhausted, yet somehow she still refused bitterness. Outside, thunder faded farther into the distance while pale sunlight finally began pushing through the storm clouds overhead. Thin beams of gold filtered through the stained glass and landed softly across Naomi's veil like warmth returning to the room inch by inch. Daniel reached over and carefully lifted one fallen rose petal from her lap. "You know what scares people?" "Like him?" he asked quietly. Naomi looked at him. "What?" Daniel smiled sadly. "Grace they cannot control." Near the church entrance, Officer Ryan Keller remained standing motionless in the rain long after every other officer had returned to their cars. The rain finally stopped 20 minutes later, leaving the church steps glistening beneath pale afternoon sunlight. Water dripped steadily from the oak trees lining Madison Avenue while guests slowly filtered back inside, carrying damp umbrellas and quiet conversations. The atmosphere had changed completely. Earlier, the church had felt warm with celebration, then cold with accusation. Now it carried something heavier, something fragile trying to hold itself together again. Naomi stood alone near the bridal room mirror, staring at the faint crease her trembling fingers had left in the satin fabric near her waist. The room smelled softly of face powder, roses, and old wood polished over decades of Sunday services. Behind her, bridesmaids whispered carefully while adjusting candles and flowers damaged during the interruption. Nobody knew exactly what to say anymore. Naomi lifted one hand toward her earrings, but stopped halfway when she noticed her fingers still shaking slightly. She lowered her hand again. The door behind her opened softly. Daniel stepped inside, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee from the church kitchen downstairs. Steam curled gently into the room between them. "Mrs. Patterson insisted you drink something warm," he said softly. offering her one cup. Naomi accepted it carefully. The heat against her palms steadied her breathing a little. Daniel watched her quietly for a moment. You do not have to force yourself through this today. Naomi stared into the coffee. Do you know what hurts the most? She asked. Daniel remained silent. For 1 second, she whispered, people believed him. The sentence settled heavily between them. Outside the small bridal room window, sunlight reflected across puddles in the parking lot, while distant sirens faded downtown. Daniel stepped closer slowly. Fear makes people forget themselves, he said quietly. Naomi looked up at him. No, she replied gently. Fear just reveals what was already there. Daniel had no answer for that. A knock interrupted the silence. One of the church volunteers leaned nervously into the doorway. Mayor Brooks, she said softly. There are reporters outside asking questions. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose. Naomi immediately straightened. You should go handle that. Not before I handle this. He reached carefully for her hand again. Listen to me, Naomi. What happened out there says everything about him and nothing about you. Naomi tried smiling, but emotion still lingered heavily behind her eyes. I know. Another knock came moments later, firmer this time. Daniel opened the door slightly. One of his security staff stood outside looking uncomfortable. Sir, the man said quietly. Officer Keller is still outside. He says he wants to speak privately before leaving. Naomi's expression dimmed instantly. The warmth inside the room seemed to cool again. Daniel's jaw tightened. Tell him to leave. But Naomi surprised him. Wait. Both men looked at her. She set the untouched coffee down slowly beside the mirror. I will talk to him. Daniel frowned immediately. Naomi, you do not owe him anything. I know. Her voice remained calm. But I do not want the last thing attached to our wedding day to be anger. Minutes later, the heavy church doors opened once more. Ryan Keller stood just inside the entrance holding his police cap tightly in both hands now instead of wearing it. Without the authority in his posture, he suddenly looked older than before. Tired. Human. Sunlight spilled through the stained glass windows across the floor between him and Naomi like a quiet line neither seemed eager to cross. Guests nearby fell silent again, pretending not to watch while watching anyway. Ryan swallowed hard before speaking. Miss Carter, he began quietly, I made a terrible mistake. Naomi said nothing. He glanced briefly toward Daniel, standing several feet behind her near the altar. I received the suspect description over dispatch, and I reacted too quickly. Naomi's eyes remained steady on his face. No, she said softly. You judged too quickly. Ryan lowered his gaze immediately. Somewhere. Near the back pews, a child dropped a program booklet onto the floor, the sound echoing strangely loud inside the silence. Naomi stepped a little closer now, her white heels clicking softly against the old church wood. Do you know what I kept thinking while you stood there accusing me? She asked. Ryan looked up slowly. I kept wondering if you even saw me as a bride at all. Ryan opened his mouth, but no words came out. Because deep down, he knew exactly why that question hurt. Officer Ryan Keller stood motionless beneath the stained glass light, while Naomi's words settled into the church one slow heartbeat at a time. The silence around them no longer felt tense. It felt exposed. Guests who had once looked uncertain now watched Ryan carefully, waiting to see whether he truly understood what had happened inside these walls. Outside, the clouds had finally begun breaking apart over Madison Avenue, thin strips of blue appearing between the fading storm. But inside the church, the air still carried the weight of humiliation that could not simply disappear with sunshine. Ryan lowered his eyes toward the floorboards beneath his boots. For the first time in years, he looked unsure of himself. I saw a report, he said quietly, almost to himself. I thought I was doing my job. Naomi nodded once. I believe you thought that. Her voice remained calm, which somehow made every word sharper. Ryan lifted his gaze slowly. Then why does it feel like I failed anyway? Naomi looked toward the rows of empty pews where wedding guests had once been laughing only an hour earlier. A flower girl's basket still rested near the aisle, tipped slightly sideways with scattered white petals around it. Because doing your job is not the same thing as seeing people clearly, she answered softly. Ryan swallowed hard. Daniel remained near the altar behind her, silent but watchful. The church lights reflected faintly against the polished badge on Ryan's chest. Naomi noticed him glance briefly at it before looking away again. Shame had finally replaced certainty. A quiet, creaking sound echoed through the sanctuary as Evelyn Carter slowly rose from the front pew once more. She walked carefully toward them with one hand on her cane, the soft tapping against the wooden floor echoing through the silence. Ryan immediately straightened out of instinct when she approached, but the elderly woman simply looked at him with tired eyes that had clearly seen too much life already. "Officer," Evelyn said gently, "can I ask you something?" Ryan nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am." Evelyn glanced toward Naomi before speaking again. "If my granddaughter had been standing here in an old sweatshirt instead of a wedding dress beside the mayor, would you still be apologizing?" Ryan's face tightened immediately. The question hung heavily in the air because everyone already knew the answer was complicated. He opened his mouth once, then closed it again. Outside the church, distant traffic hummed softly through the wet streets while sunlight continued warming the stained glass overhead. Naomi watched him struggle with the question and suddenly felt something inside her soften. Not forgiveness yet, just understanding. She realized this was probably the first time Ryan Keller had ever been forced to look directly at his own assumptions instead of hiding behind procedure. "You know what the hardest part is?" Naomi asked quietly. Ryan looked at her again. "I teach third grade reading downtown." His expression shifted slightly with surprise. "Every Monday morning, I tell my students they should never judge somebody before learning their story." She glanced around the church slowly. "Then today, in front of everyone I love, I became a story nobody wanted to learn first." Ryan looked genuinely shaken now. His shoulders seemed heavier somehow beneath the dark police uniform. "Miss Carter," "Naomi," she corrected gently. He nodded once. "Naomi, I am sorry." This time the apology sounded different. Smaller. Honest. Not spoken because the mayor stood nearby, or because reporters waited outside. Spoken because he finally heard himself clearly. Naomi studied his face for several long seconds. Then, very slowly, she stepped closer and reached toward the crooked edge of his badge where it had twisted slightly during the chaos earlier. Ryan froze as her fingers carefully straightened it against his uniform. The tiny metallic click sounded impossibly loud in the quiet church. "A badge is supposed to make people feel safe," she said softly. "Not small." Ryan's eyes lowered immediately. Emotion flickered briefly across his face before he looked away toward the stained glass windows. Daniel watched the moment silently from across the altar, understanding something important had just happened without needing anyone to explain it. Outside, the church bells finally began ringing again across the neighborhood, deep and steady beneath the clearing sky. And for the first time that entire day, Officer Ryan Keller no longer looked like the most powerful person in the room. The church slowly came back to life after that. Not loudly, not all at once. Just small sounds returning one by one like a room remembering how to breathe again. A pianist near the altar tested a few soft notes against the keys. Guests drifted carefully back toward the pews carrying damp coats and folded umbrellas. Outside, sunlight spread across Madison Avenue in long golden streaks, turning the rainwater gathered along the curb into mirrors of the afternoon sky. Naomi stood near the stained glass windows alone for a moment while everyone reorganized around her. She watched tiny drops of water slide down the colored glass, blue and red light moving gently across her wedding dress. Her bouquet rested loosely against her waist now, no longer clutched tightly in defense. Behind her, the church volunteers quietly relit candles that had burned low during the interruption. The faint scent of melted wax and roses filled the sanctuary again. Ryan Keller remained near the back in trance, uncertain whether he should stay or leave. Nobody had asked him to remain. Nobody had told him to go either. He stood with his cap held awkwardly in front of him while guests passed nearby pretending not to stare. Some recognized him from the local precinct. Others only knew him now as the officer who stopped a wedding because he trusted suspicion more than humanity. Ryan could feel every glance like pressure against his skin. Daniel approached him quietly near the church doors. "You should head home," he said calmly. Ryan nodded once, but did not move immediately. "Mayor Brooks," he said carefully, "I never intended to humiliate her." Daniel looked through the stained glass reflections stretching across the floor before answering. "Intent does not erase impact." Ryan lowered his eyes again. Daniel's voice remained steady, not cruel. "You know what makes this harder?" Ryan glanced up. "Naomi will probably forgive you before you forgive yourself." The sentence hit harder than any anger could have. Across the sanctuary, Naomi sat beside her grandmother near the front pew while Evelyn carefully adjusted the veil draped over her shoulders. The elderly woman smiled softly as she worked. Your grandfather used to say storms reveal the strength of old trees. Naomi let out a faint, tired laugh. Was Grandpa always giving speeches? Evelyn smiled wider. Only when he was right. Naomi looked down at her hands resting in her lap. I kept thinking maybe I should have yelled back at him. Evelyn stopped adjusting the veil. Would that have made you feel bigger? Naomi thought for a second before shaking her head slowly. No, then you answered correctly already. The sunlight through the stained glass shifted again, painting warm amber across Evelyn's wrinkled hands. Naomi leaned gently against her shoulder for one quiet moment, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender perfume and old cotton. It grounded her. Near the entrance, Ryan finally began walking toward the doors. His footsteps echoed softly through the church. Halfway there, he paused and looked back once more. Naomi noticed immediately. Their eyes met across the sanctuary. No anger passed between them now. Only the strange heaviness that comes after someone finally sees the truth too late. Ryan gave a small nod before stepping outside into the afternoon light. The church doors closed gently behind him with a low wooden thud. Silence followed again, but this time it felt peaceful instead of sharp. Daniel walked back toward Naomi and extended his hand toward her with a quiet smile. Mrs. Brooks, he said softly, would you still like to marry me today? A few nearby guests laughed quietly through lingering tears. Naomi looked at his hand for a long second before placing hers into it. The engagement ring on her finger caught the sunlight spilling through the stained glass and scattered tiny reflections across the pew beside them. More than ever, she whispered. Somewhere outside, church bells rang again across the neighborhood while warm wind moved through the trees lining Madison Avenue. And inside the little white church, after humiliation, accusation, and silence, kindness finally reclaimed the room. The wedding ceremony began again just after 3 o'clock that afternoon. Sunlight poured through the stained glass windows in long ribbons of gold and crimson, warming the little church with the kind of quiet peace that only arrives after a storm has finally exhausted itself. Guests filled the pews once more, though softer now than before, as if everyone understood they had witnessed something larger than embarrassment or misunderstanding. The organ played gently while Naomi stood at the end of the aisle beside her grandmother Evelyn, her white veil glowing faintly beneath the colored light. Earlier that morning she had entered this church as a bride excited for the future. Now she stood there carrying something heavier and somehow stronger. Daniel waited near the altar with his hands folded calmly in front of him, but his eyes never left Naomi. There was no fear in them anymore, only admiration. Naomi began walking slowly toward him, the soft rustle of satin echoing against the old wooden pews. Each step felt steadier than the last. The little boy carrying the wedding ring smiled at her shyly this time, instead of nervously. Naomi smiled back. Outside, reporters still lingered near the sidewalk beneath television vans and camera crews, but their voices could not reach inside the sanctuary now. The church had become its own world again. Warm, sacred, human. Near the back entrance, unnoticed by most guests, Ryan Keller stood quietly beside the final pew wearing plain clothes instead of his police uniform. No badge, no radio, no authority hanging from his shoulders anymore. Just a man standing alone with the weight of a mistake he could not undo. He had returned 20 minutes earlier, after sitting in his patrol car several blocks away, unable to drive home. Something inside him refused to leave completely. Not because he expected forgiveness, because he needed to see whether grace like Naomi's truly existed after humiliation like his. He remained near the shadows by the doorway, careful not to disturb the ceremony. The pastor's voice rose warmly through the church as Naomi finally reached the altar. Love, the elderly minister said gently, is not tested during easy moments. Love reveals itself when dignity survives difficult ones. Several guests lowered their eyes quietly after hearing those words. Daniel reached for Naomi's hands. Her engagement ring caught the sunlight again, scattering tiny reflections across his dark suit sleeve. You still look nervous, Naomi whispered softly to him. Daniel smiled faintly. I almost lost my wife before I even married her. I think I earned a little nervousness. Naomi laughed quietly for the first time all day. The sound seemed to loosen something inside the entire room. Even Evelyn wiped tears from her cheeks while smiling proudly from the front pew. The ceremony continued slowly, peacefully, every word now carrying more meaning than anyone expected when the day began. Then the pastor asked the final question. Does anyone believe these two should not be joined together? The church fell still for one suspended second. Ryan lowered his eyes immediately near the back doorway as shame tightened sharply in his chest again. But before silence could grow uncomfortable, Naomi suddenly turned slightly toward the congregation. Her eyes drifted across the guests until they finally landed on Ryan standing near the entrance. The sunlight from the open doorway framed him in pale gold. Everyone followed her gaze. Ryan looked frozen beneath it. Naomi held his eyes gently for one long moment before speaking quietly into the silence. No more interruptions today. Soft laughter moved carefully through the church, surprised and emotional all at once. Ryan's shoulders dropped slightly as though something crushing had finally loosened inside him. Daniel looked at Naomi beside him with visible disbelief. You really are extraordinary, he whispered. Naomi squeezed his hand softly. No, she replied. I just know what it feels like when someone decides who you are before you speak. The pastor smiled quietly before continuing. Outside, the clouds had fully broken apart now, revealing bright blue skies stretching over Madison Avenue. Church bells rang again across the neighborhood, while sunlight spilled through every stained glass window in the sanctuary. And near the back pew, Ryan Keller stood completely still with tears gathering silently in his eyes, because for the first time in a very long time, someone he had wronged chose to leave him with dignity instead of shame. The reception began just before sunset inside the church fellowship hall across the courtyard, where strings of warm lights hung from wooden beams and soft jazz drifted through the air like a slow heartbeat returning to normal. Earlier that day, the room had been prepared for simple celebration. Now every table carried the strange emotional tenderness that follows surviving something painful together. Guests spoke more softly than usual, while waiters moved between white tablecloths carrying plates of roasted chicken, cornbread, and sweet tea in tall glass pitchers sweating beneath the evening warmth. Naomi stood near the far windows watching golden sunlight spill across the parking lot outside. The storm from earlier had vanished completely, leaving the streets glowing amber beneath the setting sun. Her wedding shoes rested beside her chair now after hours on her feet. She curled her toes slightly against the cool wooden floor while absent-mindedly turning her wedding ring with one hand. Daniel approached carrying 2 slices of cake on small white plates. Mrs. Brooks, he said gently, you have officially survived the most stressful wedding in city history. Naomi laughed quietly and accepted the plate from him. You say that like it is comforting. Daniel smiled. I say it because somehow you still manage to stay kinder than everyone else in the room. Naomi looked down at the cake for a moment before speaking. Kindness is harder when people are watching. Daniel studied her face carefully. Then why did you still choose it? Naomi glanced toward the crowded reception hall where guests laughed carefully around folded memories of earlier humiliation. Near one corner, Evelyn danced slowly with the church pianist while children chased each other between tables carrying glowing plastic rings from the photo booth. Life had resumed, fragile but real. Because bitterness would have stayed with me longer than it stayed with him, Naomi answered softly. Daniel looked at her for a long second without speaking. Then he leaned forward and kissed her gently on the forehead, while warm sunset light spilled across the side of her face. Near the entrance of the fellowship hall, Ryan Keller stood hesitating once again. This time he wore no uniform at all, just faded jeans, a blue button-down shirt, and the exhausted expression of someone carrying too many thoughts at once. He had almost driven home twice already, but every traffic light, every quiet mile through downtown, had brought him back to the same feeling. Something unfinished remained inside him. One of the church volunteers noticed him near the doorway and looked uncertain whether to stop him. Before she could decide, Naomi saw him standing there. The room did not fall silent this time, but conversations softened noticeably as people noticed him too. Ryan walked carefully toward Naomi and Daniel, holding a small white envelope in one hand. I will only take a minute, he said quietly. Daniel's posture stiffened slightly beside Naomi, but Naomi touched his hand gently before stepping forward herself. Ryan looked nervous now in a way no police officer ever wanted to appear. I spoke with my captain this afternoon, he said carefully. I filed a report about what happened today. The full truth. Naomi listened silently. Ryan handed her the envelope. There is also a letter inside addressed to your students. Naomi blinked with surprise. My students? Ryan nodded once. You said earlier that you teach children not to judge people before learning their story. His voice tightened slightly. I thought maybe they should hear from somebody who failed at that lesson. Naomi slowly opened the envelope. Inside sat several handwritten pages folded neatly together. The ink looked slightly uneven in places, as if written by hands still unsteady with shame. Ryan glanced around the room briefly before lowering his voice. I spent years believing being a good officer meant reacting fast. But today I realized sometimes reacting fast just means thinking less deeply. The reception hall remained quietly still around them. Even the jazz music from the corner speakers seemed softer now. Naomi folded the letter carefully back into the envelope. Thank you, she said gently. Ryan looked relieved just hearing the words. Not forgiven completely, but heard. He nodded once and turned to leave. Then Naomi surprised him again. Officer Keller. He stopped. Would you like some cake before you go? Ryan stared at her in disbelief for one stunned second, while warm laughter quietly moved through the nearby tables. Naomi smiled faintly. It is red velvet, she added softly. Ryan let out the smallest breath of laughter, almost embarrassed by it. Yes, ma'am, he whispered. I would. By the time the reception ended, the city outside had turned quiet beneath a deep navy sky washed clean by the afternoon storm. The fellowship hall lights glowed warmly against the dark windows while the final guests slowly gathered coats, wrapped leftover cake in napkins, and exchanged tired hugs beneath strings of hanging lights. Laughter still floated softly through the room, but slower now, gentler, like the day itself was finally settling into memory. Naomi stood near the doorway beside Daniel watching Evelyn carefully dance one last slow song with the church pianist before everyone left. The old woman's silver earrings caught the warm light each time she turned, and her soft laugh carried faintly above the music. Naomi smiled quietly at the sight. Your grandmother has more energy than both of us combined, Daniel whispered beside her. Naomi leaned lightly against his shoulder. That woman survived raising 3 children during the worst years this neighborhood ever saw. A wedding interruption does not scare her. Daniel smiled softly, but his eyes remained thoughtful. You know people will talk about today for a long time. Naomi nodded once. Maybe they should. Outside, the wet pavement reflected the glow of streetlights stretching down Madison Avenue in long golden lines. Most of the police cars were gone now. Most of the reporters too. The city had already begun moving on to the next story. But inside the church fellowship hall, something quieter remained behind. Near the dessert table, Ryan Keller sat alone finishing the last few bites of red velvet cake Naomi had insisted he take before leaving. He held the paper plate carefully in his hands like it carried more weight than sugar and frosting. Around him, guests slowly passed without fear now, though some still watched him cautiously. Ryan understood that. Trust did not rebuild itself in a single evening. He no longer expected easy redemption. Across the room, Naomi noticed him standing to leave. Their eyes met briefly once again. Ryan walked toward her and Daniel slowly, stopping a respectful distance away this time. I just wanted to say thank you, he said quietly. Daniel folded his arms loosely but remained silent. Naomi tilted her head slightly. For the cake, Ryan gave a faint embarrassed smile. For not turning me into the worst thing I have ever done. The room around them seemed to soften again after he said it. Naomi looked at him for a long moment before answering. That choice belongs to you, Officer Keller. Not me. Ryan lowered his eyes thoughtfully. Somewhere outside, wind rustled softly through the trees lining the church courtyard. The final notes of the piano faded into silence behind them. Ryan nodded once. I think today changed something in me. Naomi's expression remained gentle. Then make sure it changes someone else too. Ryan looked confused at first. Naomi glanced toward the folded letter still tucked inside her purse. Those children in my classroom are going to grow up believing whatever adults teach them about people who look different from them. Her voice stayed calm and steady. Maybe next time somebody like you walks into a room, they will choose curiosity before fear. Ryan stood very still after hearing that. Then slowly, almost emotionally, he nodded again. I would like that. He placed the empty cake plate carefully onto a nearby table and finally headed toward the exit. This time, when the church doors opened for him, nobody tensed. Nobody whispered. He stepped out quietly beneath the glow of the streetlights and disappeared into the cool night air without another word. Naomi watched the doors close softly behind him. Daniel slipped his hand into hers. You really believe people can change? He asked. Naomi looked out through the fellowship hall windows toward the empty church steps, still shining faintly from the rain earlier that day. She thought about the accusation, the silence, the shame in Ryan's eyes, and the moment he finally stopped defending himself long enough to listen. I believe people can choose, she answered softly. Daniel smiled at her then with the kind of love that needed no audience anymore. The last church volunteers switched off the hanging lights one row at a time until only the warm glow near the doorway remained. Evelyn waved sleepily from across the room while carrying leftover flowers in her arms. Outside, the storm clouds had vanished completely now, leaving the sky wide open above Madison Avenue. And in the quiet after humiliation, after judgment, after grace, the little white church finally stood still beneath the stars, holding the silence of a day that none of them would ever forget.